All right. Hello and welcome. It's May 18th, 2023. We're here in PaperStream 5.0. I'm Daniel and joined by TCC. Please introduce yourself and then we will carry on with the stream.
Hi, my name is Tucker, TCC. Um, I am an applied entomological field statistician, and I'm here to contribute to Dan's wonderful work on of ants and aging.
Awesome. Well, this is a presentation that I gave solo some weeks ago and look forward to unpacking it in a more dyadic setting in the coming hour or so. So the talk slash conversation is of ants and aging. And here we have an ant who is proceeding on their journey from birth through health and reaches the moment of choice when they either die, whatever that means, or continue back towards health, making death not proud. And the setting of this talk was a invited talk at the Curing Aging 2023 conference in Cincinnati. I was there only virtually, and I wanted to set up some of these slides and conversational topics just to give a few reflections on ants and aging. Neither of us are experts. Together, we may even amount to being less than zero of an expert on this topic, but we're going to have a whimsical entomological journey. I'm sure of that. And we're going to talk about aging. People can read the text on the bottom here. What's interesting to you about aging overall, Tucker?
Well, I love the part about together we may be less than zero of an expert. It's awesome. Well, obviously, aging is both like a patently central part of the human experience and one of the most inscrutable parts of the human experience. It's obviously something that apparently awaits us all, and I appreciated in your opening slide the fact that like the moment of death as we understand it is really a bifurcation because it's either departure towards something that we don't know what will happen, or you avoid it and you continue in this realm of living. So both for poetic reasons, scientific reasons, personal reasons, I find the topic of age, health, death to be very compelling and interesting. And I also think that we're approaching a time where these questions are becoming increasingly pertinent as the science develops, as our understanding of human senescence develops, and also as we're kind of having a reification of what it means to be human in the context of AI and increased lifespans. So there's never been a better time to look not only at our own biology and our own experience, but also at those of our neighbor and brotherly, sisterly organisms on the planet.
Awesome. So, in terms of a roadmap, we will first go over some motivations and definitions. What are ants? What is aging? Why do we study them in that intersection? We'll talk about why biological aging occurs, not to have an answer to it, but more to introduce the Tinbergen four questions framework to explore biological whys. Have a few discussions on maps, territories, and beyonds, and questions and answers will be occurring throughout. If you're watching live, you can also write something in the live chat. We'll see it. So, first to the motivations and definitions. All right. So, it's kind of awkward like when you have a joke and the setup is like the punch like we're laughing at you, Tucker. We're not laughing with you in this setting. But the joke is what's in common amongst these three organisms? Here we have Zach, Tucker, and Colony 593 or something like that out in the sandy plains in the land of enchantment. And the answer to that joke is all three are totally fit 6 foot guys who are about 27 years old. So what was happening here?
Well, I'll first say at least two out of three of the peoples or persons in this photo are wearing my shirts. So there's one more thing in common at least. To give a little real world context, we were helping Dan do his PhD research out in the south South Mexican. What do they call it? New Mexican. Excuse me, New Mexican, Arizonan, because it's right on the border desert. And we were counting ants leaving their specifically Pogon Myrmex ants leaving their colony entrances to go out foraging in the early parts of the day. And we were counting how many were coming and going. And then that was related to dopaminergic research to see how dopamine regulates their collective and individual behaviors. Dan, of course, did some makeup on all the ants to paint them, and so that was for data tracking. And I think what you're getting at here, Dan, is what is common among these three organisms. Clearly, you know, there's not three 6 foot 27-year-olds here. I don't even think there's one. But I think you're getting at there are three organisms in their foraging prime. We have the ants, obviously, in their food foraging prime. And we have Zach and myself in our data foraging prime, that sweet spot of around 27. Um, yeah, so we're like in our most fittest, robust state to do work, observing
Mm,
them observing us. Maybe they were counting us. I don't know.
awesome. Yeah. Well, we were at this field site, and it is right on the New Mexico Arizona border. Like literally on the right side of this photo, it's New Mexico, but over the hills on the left side are squarely in Arizona. The field site is a long term field research site by Stanford professor Deborah Gordon, who is my PhD advisor. And she's been coming summer after summer to this field site, students and otherwise, to study this location and the red harvester ants that live there. And the red harvester ants have a single queen, and they have several thousand workers in a colony. And importantly, they very rarely relocate. And so that's enabled studies that put a rock with a dog tag next to the colony so we can come right back to the same location and see how's colony 593 doing. And that long-term field site, as well as several other long-term field sites in Pocono Miramax, have established that these single queens, and by virtue of that, the colony can live for well over 25 years. Now, such lifespan studies are not possible in most ant species because they relocate or they live in an acorn or in the leaf litter or underground or so on. But this is a ant species with a natural history such that we can very, very easily return year after year and determine that they do have this incredible long lifespan. That kind of whets the appetite to think about aging because the queen, as a six-bodied insect nestmate, or six-legged, sorry, multi-bodied in other ways, her lifespan is orders of magnitude more than other insects. And so it's like, well, what is happening with the way that what looks like a body plan that should go age and die pretty fast, and that's what we see globally, there is some evolutionary or ecological setting that perhaps death be not proud for the Pocono Miramax queen.
Yeah, and just to follow up there, not only is it orders of magnitude than many other kinds of insects longer living, but also an individual queen is orders of magnitude longer living than her other nestmates, despite having much, if not all, of the same core genetic information in her body as her daughters do, which is pretty incredible. It's like what switches are being turned on in that context. Obviously, she's in a very stable environment in the New Mexican desert. There's not a lot of tectonic shifts. There's not even a lot of rainfall. It's like a sandy loam that they can build a long-term home in. But really fascinating. I have a question, Dan, after I looked over this slide. And I brought it up earlier in text. Why do you think there may not be any apparent uh, benefit or advantage to living longer based on related to the probability of leaving child colonies? That's that graph in the middle right side there. So an ant colony that lives a particularly long time, the longer it lives, it doesn't have a necessarily any higher chance of leaving behind child colonies. Is that because what are the mechanisms going into that?
So I eagerly await broader studies because we only have the parentage relationships at this several hundred meters squared. And so we only know what's happening on that field site. The fecundity is here in terms of their probability of leaving a child colony that year. So it
Mm,
isn't that the longer lived ones have like a lower rate per year. It's actually just like, it's kind of like if you're sending gynes, if you're sending drones, sending reproductive alates to the mating swarm, then any reproductively able colony is sending them as well as any other colony. So they're all kind of just like, they're all throwing in the reproductive cards And at least at this sample size and scale, there wasn't a reason to think that like it's not like the older colonies are like better or worse at making reproductives.
Yeah, one of the questions that brought up for me is, if a human lives a long time, they presumably gain some amount of wisdom, and an orca lives to be 100 years and it's able to pass on its hunting wisdom and culture to successive generations that it lives with. But it seems like in these ant colonies, maybe because of the very cyclical nature of the worker generations where they turn over every 2 weeks or every few months, there's not a lot of information passage to gain annually accruing benefits and have an advantage. So it's kind of like a reset every year. So a colony that's 20 years old doesn't have either the informational or physical infrastructure benefits that might come from longevity, like we see in other species.
Yes.
Yeah, I
So,
think that makes me curious.
oh,
Long-term memory,
yep,
what's the point of growing old?
colony learning. And, does the skin learn when the cells are the same age, but it's an older tissue? And so what's happening in the colony? So ants, we know them, we love them, we see them, we count them. I wanted to differentiate here that age is not equivalent to aging. So age, we're going to say, is the amount of time, or chronos, that has elapsed during the lifespan of an individual. So age is just a number. They really don't lie when they tell you that. Aging, however, is a specific process and embodied outcome. We can think about that happening through time in like kairos, and it's associated with a wide variety of symptoms or syndromes, or even just as speaking, as an increased risk of death, like a death curve, probability of dying through time. Whereas if it were flat, that doesn't mean that the organism that doesn't age doesn't mean it lives forever. It just means that it's not having an increased risk of death. And aging is different than age. And whatever we think about these terms, it is not a prescriptive or a normative judgment. And there's been a lot of conversations around like whether aging should be considered a disease of its own, for example, to enable diagnoses and insurance funding and all of this, or whether aging should be seen some other way. But that's kind of why we're studying aging. And here we are going to return to this, but the computational boundary of a self, work by Michael Levin. And we have these time cones of nested intelligences. And in fact, even the ant colony is shown here. So we have like the colony. Now, I would argue that the colony is an organism, as we'll come back to later. But the colony is consisting of these nested systems, the nestmate and the cell and so on. And so when we think about aging for ants or for humans, and we can kind of compare that to the ship of Theseus, or the fractal ship of Theseus, what are we really talking about? What if the ants are all aging rapidly, but then the colony lives on? Then do ants age? What if ants don't age, nestmates, but colonies do? Then do ants age? And so when we're talking about aging in humans, we're going to return to what scale of analysis is relevant to consider, but just to kind of put it all out there on the table that we're taking this multi-scale consideration of these systems, and ants are just a system where we can't not take the multi-scale perspective. And so then it serves as kind of like an intuition pump for bringing that multi-scale view onto other systems. All right. So why does biological aging occur? So if only it were that simple that the -4 experts on this phone call could come to an answer, but we're going to explore it nonetheless. So it being 2023, the first thing I did when making this presentation was ask GPT-4, provide the top 80 hypotheses for why biological aging occurs, just as a simple list. And they're all shown here. And what really struck me is they're all essentially molecular processes, either specific things that happen to molecules like DNA damage or genetic mutation, or just molecular physiological processes like mitochondrial dysfunction, in many times even referencing very specific molecules. So This just reflects people's language use, and a topic for another day is language models more generally. But this reflects the kind of discourse, the kind of language use that people are using around biological aging, such that the algorithm that is GPT-4 is replying with these 80 hypotheses given its training data set when it was prompted this way. But despite it being sometimes a reductionist environment scientifically that we're in, explanations in biology are not strictly mechanistic. Rather, mechanistic explanations are only one of a broader way of thinking about why or because type questions in biology. And so one way that that's been studied in behavioral biology generally through Tinbergen's original work in the 1900s, as well as specifically in the case of sociogenomics and the social insects with Karen Kaphine's work from 2018 here, where this image is from. Tinbergen's 4 questions have helped structure thinking in response to why questions. Why things happen are shown as this set of 4 questions. A why exists across all 4 of these quadrants: the proximate and ultimate columns, and the contemporary and historical columns. The contemporary proximate is the mechanistic causation, everything that GPT was telling us in the previous slide. The contemporary ultimate explanation is the current utility or function. The proximate historical why is development or ontogeny, and the historical ultimate explanation is evolution. And this is by analogy to Aristotle's 4 causes. So why is there a statue there? Or why is the person building a statue? The material cause is because there is stone in the shape of a statue there. That's actually quite boring, and we're often interested in other becauses, like because somebody is chiseling it out, or because they want to make a statue, or because there's a place for that statue in the temple. And so this kind of broadens the discussion around why, and we're going to first look at an example of applying Tinbergen's 4 questions, and then we're going to dive into using those to talk about aging in ants and humans. So we're going to talk about, why is that house decayed? So this is going to be like kind of by analogy, but as a simpler analogy to why does aging happen in ants and humans. And written here, which I won't read through, are some because stories, in other words, responses to the question why, that highlight that there's always a multiplicity of whys. It's not enough just to have a list of molecular explanations. Even if those were exhaustive, we still would want other non-mechanistic answers, because just saying that the house is decayed because it is broken that way doesn't convey the same type of information that these other becauses convey, like how things came to be and how it functions. Any thoughts on this before we jump into more of the ant and human specifics?
Not directly. I'm interested to see how we're going to tie this into the question of aging, so we'll stay tuned.
All right, so we're going to go through each of these quadrants one by one and give that kind of an answer to why aging happens in ants and humans. So first we're in the ontogenetic, or the developmental. So in both ants and humans, we can certainly recognize that aging is a developmental or a lifelong process. And there's been a lot of research in humans with studying lifelong trajectories of aging. And we can think about aging on multiple scales with ants. So we can think about the aging of the nestmate. In other words, their journey from egg through pupa and larva on through young adult, all the way to being an aged adult, if they're a worker and a forager happening at that stage. And that process of development and the behavioral changes associated with it is called temporal polyethism. We can also think about colony aging, and it's been established, but again, it's very difficult to look at these multi-year studies and to estimate the lifespans of colonies in the wild and to develop biologically realistic settings in the laboratory. But colony aging has been studied. And for example, it's been shown that there are behavioral tendencies of Pogon and Myrmex colonies that exist for older but not younger colonies, despite the workers having the same age distributions. But importantly, we can say that there are ant species where the colonies don't age. That is to say that the immortal colonies have asexual reproduction or intranest sexual reproduction. So it just is a propagative entity that just continues and grows through fusion and budding, but doesn't have its own life cycle of like being a young founded colony, being a middle-aged colony, and then being a senescent colony, if such a thing even exists. But rather, there are ant colonies which are ageless in the sense that they persist and grow propagatively. And one useful framework before you give a comment is the trade-off between reproduction and survival. And as this Rodriguez and Flat synthesis paper argues, in non-social insects, so let's just say non-eusocial hymenopterans, reproduction outweighs survival. This is often also discussed in an R versus K selection framework. But in the eusocial insects, there's a balance of reproduction and survival such that they're able to stay fecund while also surviving at the colony level. So, any thoughts on this? Developmentally, why does aging happen?
Well, some of my initial thoughts are it's interesting to think about Pogonomyrmex colonies because they do have a single queen throughout their existence, and to my understanding, at least, this queen is never replaced. When the queen dies, the colony dies. So they live a single generation of a queen, despite the fact that that queen might live 25 years or more. And then other colonies like Argentine ants have multiple queens at a time and are constantly cycling through queen lifespans. And so in that sense, they can perpetuate. I'm also going to look at this Barton et al. 2002 paper about different behavioral effects, despite the workers having the same age distribution, but the colony itself being of an older age. I wonder what specific factors influence that behavior. Is because the queen is giving out different pheromones? Is it like, how do they quote unquote know? It's
Yeah,
really fascinating.
yep, agreed. All
I
right,
see you
moving
opening a
on.
link here.
Moving on to the causation quadrant. So here is where we have the more traditional mechanistic or molecular explanations for aging. And so on the human side, we see those 80 molecular hypotheses that ChatGPT provided us. And we also have highlighted some citations related to insulin and aging. So these are just kind of representative of the absolutely relevant, but not whole picture that is any story around some molecule. Insulin is certainly important, and as these authors argue, most of the age-related diseases have been associated with impairment of action of an important hormone, namely insulin. So it's not just why things go wrong, but maybe even improving insulin action with, for example, sleep, fasting, exercise, temperature of play, cognitive security practices, oxygen uptake. All of these kinds of things might have a influence on a wide variety of molecules. And conversely, on the ant side, people have studied overlapping sets of molecules. Ants also have insulin-like peptides, insulin signaling, kind of derived from a common insulin signaling ancestor. And again, this Rodriguez and Flat synthesis review that discussed the reproduction survival trade-off, they highlight that queens of the highly eusocial social insects exhibit both enormous reproductive output and longevity, escaping the trade-off. Here we argue that the proximate, ding, 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 reason for why eusocial insects can decouple this trade-off is they have evolved a different wiring of the IIS-JH VGYP circuit. So insulin-like IGF-1 signaling, IIS, JH, juvenile hormone, VG, vitellogenin, and YP, yolk protein, which is associated with reproduction aging. And this is just an example of what it looks like. It's like a wiring diagram that they're wiring up differently, that it enables different connections. But if it were as simple as just doing a differential wiring and there weren't other trade-offs or contexts, then, other solitary insects would be living and working that way. So it's part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. And it's a very exciting and ongoing area of research to study the molecular causes and consequences of aging in ants. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's fascinating work. I had never drawn the connection from the fact that something like insulin that's found in humans and other mammals also has analogs in insects, and that people are studying this to discover its relationship to aging. That's really, really cool. Um, yeah, I wonder, do you know of any other natural systems where this there seems to be this escape of the high reproductivity resulting in a shorter lifespan. Obviously, we see it here in ants, but where else?
Good question. I think I'm reminded of in the honeybees the difference between the bread that is fed to the worker bound larva and of course the royal jelly, which contains a lot of molecules that directly influence the epigenome of the developing queen, but also there's a different macronutrient balance, and she's in a
Mhm.
bigger cell. So it's like the interactions of all these factors like macronutrients, micronutrients, nootropics, epigenomic modulators, and the context
Mhm.
and the care, they all interact in these really fascinating ways to lead to different developmental outcomes, even from the same genome.
Yeah, fascinating.
Cool. All right. Current utility. So this is where we talk about the function in the moment, contemporary, ultimate. Ultimate doesn't mean last. Ultimate means just like to what end, the teleological. So the local teleology is the function. The ultimate contemporary utility of a knife is to cut things. So, what is the utility of aging? Now, one answer that cannot be simply persuaded away is there may be no utility. Life may be existing, finessing, dancing on the order versus disorder trade off frontier, and aging may simply represent the wheels falling off and just things get messed up and attracting sets only attract until they don't. And so there doesn't necessarily need to be a utility to aging. And that may be system or situation specific. However, we can ask whether there may be some sort of a function to aging at the individual or population level. So, for example, in humans, Leaky 2023 has explored this concept of phenoptosis by Skolachev's earlier work, the idea that aging is a programmed process to speed the exit of individuals posing some danger to their social group. And so, in other words, there's a kind of functionality, yes, realized through evolution, which we're going to cover, but a functionality in the moment for the aging process. We can also think of an analogous argument in ants. So, for example, what might be the utility of colonies aging? So, again, by analogy to the phenoptosis, we could imagine that colonies at the population scale age and remove themselves. Also, there might be this sort of constraint answer, which is to say, like, eventually sperm storage just runs out. And so that Pogonomyrmex queen is unable to pump out new workers. But there's so many different reproductive life histories, like including clonal ants, that it's not as easy as just saying it's about any given one constraint. And then at the nestmate level, it's very easy to think what the utility of aging or temporal polyethism might be. When the adult nestmate worker is born, they have the highest body fat content, they're already in the brood chamber, and their nursing glands are pretty much already good to go. And then as they develop and learn and go on these orienting walks or flights, if there be, around their colony, they develop better abilities to engage with their environment. They take out the trash. They work on the nest architecture. And then when their body fat is low, their experience is high, and their value to the colony has to a large extent already been contributed, then they can engage in foraging, which is, as we know all too well, it's the absolute riskiest work that any nestmate can do.
Super high entropy, but also the most rewarding. I mean, you're the first one to get that nectar on your lips. Nothing like it.
But it's not for you.
It's for everybody.
It's like we do it for ourselves, but we do it for the colony. And there's
Yeah,
no reason why it can't be both.
100%. I was thinking here when you mentioned the leaky paper, and this idea of phenoptosis, it reminds me of the idea of term limits. It's like to prevent any individual from accruing too much power or too much negative influence in the system. Um, you put, an end date to it. Um, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Um, hold on. There's one more thing I want to bring up. I don't remember the author or the researcher. She's a female in Germany, has a lab out there, and I think we spoke to her at SWOR, Southwest Research Station. She has studied in the lab how to make worker ants live longer because queens obviously can live quite a long time. And she's worked on making the workers of those same species live comparatively longer lives to the wild type workers. Do you remember that research and how this might tie in?
Not remembering it right now.
Okay, forget it for now. But that it's interesting research because um, discovering what makes these workers live these very short lives, despite having much of the same biology as the queens, is obviously part of the equation. So let's continue.
Yeah. And here's from the leaky paper. This is just very interesting across different species, the mass and the metabolic rate. And these are the kind of patterns that we see in biology where it's like we need an explanation that goes beyond any given context or species. Yet that explanation must be compatible with every single last mile, every last nanometer of each of these diverse systems bodies. So that's why we need a multiplicity, a plurality of Ys, because why the mouse is here in this graph or any other graph is going to be addressable with a bigger zoomed out picture. Why are there these fundamental trade-offs? And why in the specifics with the mechanistic causation in the moment. Let's get to the last quadrant. All right, so here, what is the evolutionary basis or account of aging? So if we were going to restrict ourselves to the evolutionary why does aging evolve? Why has aging happened to be the case? And here, it's a little recap of PaperStream 1.0 that was on kin and multi-level selection, an approach using causal graphs by Samir Akasha from 2016. So I'd recommend watching PaperStream 1 for more information. We're just going to like basically say the bare minimum here, and it's unpacked more in the past. The reason why I used it here was not just to save time while preparing these slides, but rather to point to the fact that our narratives and models of evolution do bear upon how we think things are and the explanations and the accounts that we deploy in the moment. So, for example, for many people and for many decades, there seemed to be, or was speculated to be, some kind of a distance between kin and multi-level selection. In other words, could we understand behaviors like altruism or even just social behavior in general by looking at, as kin selection has suggested, the direct genetic relationships? Or, as the multi-level selectionists suggested, rather, we would only understand those complex phenomena by understanding the population or the metapopulation scales. And so this paper is going to approach that using the Bayesian graphs that we know and love from active inference free energy principle. So first is a case, and hint, slash to spoil the ending, Akasha is going to show that they're formally equivalent, yet that doesn't mean that they're both right in any given case. So here's kin selection. Figure 2 is showing a case where kin selection is causally adequate. In this case, the individual phenotypic character is having a direct cost on individuals' fitness, and they're also able to have this indirect effect by their relatedness scaled by the effect of their partner on their fitness. So everyone's fitness is composed of their own phenotype plus some kind of multiplication between their relatedness to their partner's phenotype. And that's where we get the famous R times B is greater than C as like this kind of threshold of cooperation in the classic Hamilton 1964 type explanations. Here's a slightly more complex case where kin selection is still causally adequate, where there is a group character, there is a collective behavior, there is a group level emergent phenomena. However, that group character does not contribute to group fitness. Rather, still, it is only individual fitnesses that sum up to the group fitness. So kin selection is causally adequate. There's no need to appeal to multi-level selection. In contrast, there are cases where only multi-level selection is causally adequate. So in this setting, the phenotypic characters of individuals in the population together constitute a group phenotype. That group phenotype constitutes the group fitness. So individual foraging behavior, nestmate foraging behavior, colony foraging rate, that is the group fitness trait. There's no edge between the individual foraging proclivities and the group fitness. And so individual fitness is downstream of group fitness, in which case it only makes sense to talk about multi-level selection as being relevant here, because the kinship relationships, the relatedness amongst individual 1 and 2, are not playing into the group fitness and thereby the individual fitness. And Akasha concludes that this opposition between kin and multi-level selection approaches to social evolution has polarized evolutionary biologists and those who love them. Recently, theorists have increasingly come to regard the two approaches as equivalent, on the grounds that a correct expression for allele frequency change in structured populations can be written using either approach. However, this establishes only that kin selection and multi-level selection are formally equivalent, not that they constitute equally adequate causal descriptions of the evolutionary process. That's quite interesting. It's saying you can describe it both ways, but that doesn't mean that both the descriptions are going to be valid with respect to the causal architecture. And some more points are brought up, but it's a little bit of a non sequitur slash indirect explanation for why aging happens. But the reason why I put it there, other than to, again, not have to explain or give an answer to this incredibly challenging question and global scale or, solar system scale question about the evolutionary ultimate historical functionality of aging, just to say that even our mathematical models and some of the kinds of debates that have enlivened the field for a long time, those are merely multiple views on the very limited and sometimes mysterious patterns that we observe empirically.
Yeah. I just want to make sure that I understand. I'm going to work off your example of, I'm specifically referring to how an individual phenotype behavior influences group fitness, and then individual fitness is downstream of that. Actually gets back to what I said about, the best part about foraging is being the first one to taste the nectar. And you said, but it's not for you, it's for everybody. And I'm going to use this example to try to make sure I'm understanding the point here. An individual character here, the foraging behavior, an ant goes out and gets a seed. Despite that being its behavior, it actually doesn't benefit directly from that seed. It doesn't consume that seed. It brings it back to the colony's stores. And then from there, the colony feeds itself en masse, so to speak. And then from there, that's where the individual actually derives its fitness. It's not based on how many seeds it got or what it did that day, but rather how the whole collection of ants foraged. And then the kind of fitness is distributed across that group. Is that a good explanation or an example?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And so it just shows that the way that people sometimes use this kind of, well, why does the nestmate go out there for the seed? Well, because she has 1/4, 1/2, or 3/4 relatedness to this larva. And so this increases this allele's frequency in the population, all of these kinds of things. That's the kin selection account. And the math is going to add up either way. But when we think about the causal structure of the world, it isn't that a given forager is realizing individual fitness plus any indirect benefits. Rather, the phenotypes of foragers contribute to the colony's ability to persist year after year, and they don't even send out reproductives for the first several years in Pogon and Myrmex. So, let alone most of the workers not even making any sort of egg laying at all. And so in this case, it's like the colony is better described by the multi-level selection causal account, which isn't to say that the math, again, doesn't line up as well, but it's kind of like from the same accounting sheet, we could apply like another accounting method and come to the same numbers, but it's going to tell like a different structure. And so it really just puts an interesting lens on some of these debates, like are they doing it because they're related, or are there other multi-level phenomena at play? And also, in the context of humans and our incredibly enmeshed, extended technological society, is it really reasonable to think about direct fitness being realized by individuals? I mean, it takes at least another person one to reproduce with, if not to prepare the future technologies that, make a skin cell into something else. So no person is an island, and arguably the causal architecture of human reproduction fits better with something like a multi-level selection scheme rather than a kin selection scheme, which isn't to say that the math isn't going to line up for both. It is. But ask
It takes
yourself,
a
which one
village.
has a causal architecture that lines up with what is actually happening out there in the world?
Yeah, it takes a village.
Yeah. So let's just in our sort of closing sections and thoughts explore just some different topics. So we're navigating life and aging, and the map is not the territory, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have at least multiple maps. In fact, the map being not the territory is made tangible when we have multiple maps. So we're going to look at two different maps for thinking about humans and ants. And then we're going to talk about how the decisions that we make around which maps to use when and how relates to how we think about human and ant aging. So here's the first map. In this map, we have ant colonies are like societies of humans. Ant nestmates are like individual bodied people. 6 legs, 2 legs. And the organs of ant nestmates are like the organs of humans. After all, don't they have a brain and we have a brain and so on? And so if that is the case, and the person is the organism, that makes the nestmate the organism. That makes ants social insects. Colonies are then like societies. And they're such integrated and amazing societies that people have called them superorganismal. They're they're not just awesome organisms, and they are, but they're actually above organismal level, like a supraorganism. And we see this kind of a map 1 being shown everywhere from the Far Side comics to the disinformation propagated by mainstream media and TV, on through sociobiology and the titles of books by Holdobler and Wilson, like Superorganism. And this superorganism concept plays out again and again. It's implicitly a mapping with a colony as superorganism to society as organism, or superorganism, where people are individual organisms. So we see this map all the time. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, it does seem to draw a barrier at the superorganism level as humans see it, like an ant colony. But I'm not familiar with Holdobler and E.O. Wilson as kind of the stewards of this original theory, taking it further and saying actually a colony of colonies therefore would be a superorganism, or a galactic federation of semi-sentient planets would become a super planet, something like that. Do you know if there's any follow-up work on that, or it really does have this in some sense arbitrary barrier? Humans see 2 beehives and they see 2 superorganisms.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's contrast this though. Superorganism perspective. Ant colonies are superorganisms, nestmates are organisms, with another map. This map, we're going to have colonies as organisms map together to person. In this way, a population of colonies, like the one that we talked about at the long-term field site, is like a society of humans. And nestmates, including their organs, are tissues of the social organism, of the colony organism. So a worker is like a differentiated skin cell. It happens to be one that's disconnected or mobile relative to the other pieces, but again, they're different organisms, so it's only to be expected. And it's interesting that this ant colony as organism was actually one of the early and influential works by W.M. Wheeler, and that was building upon historical philosophical traditions related to the organism as being the scale of analysis where things made sense, a teleological closure. The organism is an end in and of itself. And if you haven't identified the system that is its own end, then you haven't yet identified the organism in the Kantian sense. And so this second map We don't need to call the colony an organism, a superorganism, because it just is an organism. We don't call a person a super single cellular creature. We can just say it's a multicellular creature. So we can call a colony like a multi-bodied creature, but that doesn't make it a super organism because organismality has always referred to whatever functional scale of organization enabled that thing to exist in evolutionary populations that undergo the kind of natural selection, drift, mutation processes that are characteristic of evolution. So this is just a second map. And again, just to compare it, colonies, society, nestmate to people, organs to each other, or do we slide it so that populations are like societies of humans and colonies like people? What do you think about map two?
Yeah, well, I just want to say first that thinking about this, it becomes clear that it's not map one versus map two, and it's not kin selection versus multi-level selection. It's both context and frame dependent. What you're talking about and how you want to be talking about it. Because when we were bringing out the map two part, I was thinking, well, uh, like why, why isn't an organ tissue cell in and of itself, like good enough for itself? Why isn't an individual ant an organism on its own terms rather than being an organ of a colony? And to get to that teleological point, it's because the ant can't exist in isolation, right? An ant can't live by itself. And famously, if you put a honeybee in a box, even if you feed it, it'll die. It requires this collectiveness to survive. But there's plenty of other organisms that live in a liminal space between collectivization and individuality. There's spiders that are semi-colonial sometimes, and then live individually. So they don't fit directly onto one map or the other. Sometimes they're a tissue, and sometimes they are the organism. So that was the main thought that I had from that.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's like a superposition,
Mm,
and there might be some situations, maybe contrived or natural, where one map or the other is the territory. I mean, if you set up your territory to be this map, then great, you've done it. But these are just two maps of the territory, and we have both in our mind. And so it's like kind of like leaning on one foot or the other when we're running. It's just a blend or superposition of these maps. But let's look at some memes that also show that.
amazing. Finally.
So here, entolinguists, I put our own image over it. So we have our own bifacial entolinguist. So here we have Drake on the left, top left, looking at the state of the literature, looking at this apparent contradiction or tension, eusociality. So true or good and social. So the highest level of sociality is what? Then you get rug pulled and then you're not social anymore? So is social its own end that enshrines the individual participant? But then can that happen to such an extreme level of organization that it actually becomes its own individual, such that we don't call the blood vessel and the white blood cell and the muscle, we don't call those social single cellular organisms. We wouldn't say we're single cellular social. We could just say, again, we're just a multicellular body. And so here we see those two maps. So are ants truly social? Like they're really social guys? Or are ants eusocial, which from an etymology, not entomology perspective, would have the same meaning, but there we are as entolinguists sweating because the tension is undeniable. But thankfully, lower left Drake, who's familiar with Mike Levin's work as well as with our work, let's be real, is basically just nodding in approval, not taking a stance on which map is better for the territory, because I think we've established that saying which map is better for the territory, especially in the general case, is just a losing effort.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that Drake was up to speed on Levin's work, but I can tell now from looking at his photo that he must be
You know what that bioelectricity mean? It can only mean
for
one
real.
thing.
Yeah, for real. This reminds me a little bit of another foundational, though somewhat tangential, ant research paper, which is Wittgenstein. and
Oh,
his reference in Deborah Gordon's work, Wittgenstein and the Ants, about what it means to actually be observing. Like, what does the observer consciously and more importantly, subconsciously bring to their table? How do they frame the insects or the animals that they're observing? And then from there, derive hypotheses. Like, what does it mean for a human to think, oh, it's hunting, oh, it's foraging, oh, it's resting? And that reminds me here about eusociality. Like, what does it mean for organisms to be cooperating? What does it mean for organisms to be working together? And it's even dependent on our own perceptive capabilities, because we see ants are, they're much smaller than us, but they're very much on a human perceptive scale. Whereas like a biofilm, which might be more or less quote unquote eusocial than an ant colony, is in many ways inscrutable to the human perceptive apparatus. And so we don't think about it in those terms. And maybe a planet level collective consciousness is also beyond our conception as individual humans. So we kind of narrowed the window down to the small thing of like things that are a little bit smaller than us, but not too much bigger, where we can fit in a quote unquote eusocial definition. These are
yeah,
my initial thoughts.
yeah. Saying that an ant is smaller than us is map one. Because when we think about the Argentine ant colony that covers, all of California or a whole continent, that is bigger than we are, unless you go full,
Mhm.
map one maxing, and you say, well, ants are smaller than us because humans are global, and so we are bigger than them. But I mean, this just shows that it's not so obvious. If we're just, oh, well, define where the skin cells are, and that's the end of the organism, it just doesn't work for the ants, and it doesn't work for humans. And so, just again, when we say, well, what's bigger, one human child or one Argentine ant? If somebody says, well, the ant is the size of their pinky nail, then that shows that they're thinking about map one. And if they say, well, the one Argentine ant can
Hide
be
your children.
800 miles long. Yeah. But it just shows how this is why entolinguistics is so important, because if people were shamed for saying that ants were smaller than humans, then map 2 would be enforced. And
Mhm.
that's not even necessarily a better world, just a different one. Right now, map 1 is being enforced. That's why people can laugh at it and it kind of like makes sense to their frame of reference. Let's look at this last mimetic slide.
We should
So,
ask ChatGPT how big is an ant to see what
yeah,
map it has
uh,
implicitly built in.
that's a great question for any language model. So here we are in the kind of final slide. We can chill and explore this for a little bit. We have the two maps up top. On the upper left, map 1, upper right, map 2. I'll put us in the middle. Brower et al., Pivotal Mental States, 2020. I borrowed a figure from it. And there's a person on a rowboat, and it's the serotonin receptor, but here we're just treating it as like the human more broadly, not just the mechanism, all of the Timbergen's whys and the why nots. And there's this pivotal moment. And the pivotal moment is whether we're going to use map 1 or map 2. We're in superposition. And then we're going to be able to collapse the wave function through our speech or other action into ant is bigger or ant is smaller than. And in that pivotal moment where we are navigating territory, and are we going to do the left turn based upon this map or on this map? Those are the overlapping contexts, in fact, are aging over evolutionary, ecological, developmental timescales that lead up to this pivotal cognitive moment where we have the will to decide how to act. And here's the future with reversed context over multiple timescales, the consequences of our actions or some other way to view time. But it's just kind of a interesting way to think about it, because we're not closing with an answer. I don't think that we addressed why aging happens in humans and ants. I don't think that we have any sort of million Bitcoin pharmaceutical in the pipeline. But I think, at least while making this presentation and in our years of discussions around similar topics, it's just really impressed upon me that to want something other than this, other than agency at the moment of choice with respect to the superpositioning of multiple perspectives, where else would we rather be? On the shore as a spectator, or, in the water, lost in the sauce, or just put me over where it's sunny?
Mm. Sometimes you have to go into the darkness. Um, yeah, we definitely didn't answer much about aging, that's for sure. Still much in the dark about that, but working towards elucidating that. Um, one question I have quite frequently about death is if humans achieve to break out of our, we'll call it natural limitation of 100 or 120 years of longevity, what will that mean for our relationship to reproduction? Because before we had those scales of reproduction versus survival, right? Every organism and every collection of organisms is representing and working on a balance of that. But if we get to the point where we're able to increase our pseudo immortality indefinitely, maybe it won't be about reproduction, it'll just be about persistence through time. Um, which again will call into question about what it means to die and what it means to live. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. It's not really related to ants at all. It's just more of a philosophical question about like we're not necessarily destined to die. Humans have died for a long time.
If the body is the human, then yes, but if the body is the population, then humans have never died. A human
Mm,
has never died.
yeah, the human.
But we also don't want to deceive ourselves into a deathly state. I guess this is where it gets so tied up with humans, with
Mm,
our normativity and our morals, our ethics, our values, which are so important. But I think as we've explored out there in the desert, the ant colony gives us space to think about multi-scale complex systems, not absent a moral or ethical loading, but just a recognition that whatever they're doing, it's different. And so
yeah.
that enables us to kind of ask how it would be for them, and then ask like how is it different when we bring our own human preferences to the table, and what will happen when people exert their preferences for lifespan and reproduction in new technologically extended ways. And that has been happening and it will continue happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. I have another more unrelated question, though more related to ants. And we spoke about this briefly beforehand, but it's somewhat related to death too. Um, and aging. So Argentine ants, like we mentioned, are typically multigynous, many queens, and they can persist through many generations of queens, and and the colony might be as much as 800 or 1,000 or more miles long because it's many interrelated colonies that have been observed to cooperate in non-adversarial ways. Um, do you know what a few questions to frame it. Do you know what the mechanism by which related colonies recognize each other is? Has it been definitively shown to be hydrocarbons? Is it some genetic marker? Um, and then the second question to that is because Argentine ants obviously are quote unquote a pest, though I don't necessarily agree with that label, but they are in California and other Mediterranean climates wreaking havoc on quote unquote natural or indigenous ecosystems. So can that mechanism, if it's been discovered, be interrupted in a way such that colonies no longer recognize each other correctly, maybe via gene drive or I don't know, a Miramico pharmaceutical intervention.
Mm,
Big pharma pipeline. Let's go.
mm, big ant.
Little ant.
To the first question, I think we can look into it, but I'm pretty sure that hydrocarbons will play an important role in the self non self recognition of colonies. People have done a lot of studies on the genetic and the hydrocarbon diversity of the Argentine ants in California and elsewhere. And
Yeah,
like
Tutsi.
Yeah, exactly, like Nilsitsi. And what's interesting is although there's limited diffusion of workers within one colony, once what they call a super colony, map 3, um there's limited diffusion like on the order of hundreds of meters, let's say, yet there still are coherent selves in the sense that they share resources and they have non-aggression behavior when they're confronted with each other across many miles. And in contrast, you'll have a river where on both sides of this river, or on like two sides of a street in suburbia, famously, you have like two different colonies that do conflict. So it's like some combination potentially of genetic diversity and enculturation of hydrocarbons. And then you brought up this kind of like, could you dissolve a big bad ant by making its subunits have differential recognition? So, for example, in Argentina, other than there being an ecology that keeps the ant species more in check, also the colonies are smaller, so they don't form such extensive areas of recognition. And so it's almost like by interfering with the message passing somehow, you could cause like a breakdown in the order. Now, how to do that in a way that isn't just that doesn't just like you can't, if you spray something over 1 square mile, gene drive or whatever, and it if effectively breaks down the big bad ant in that 1 square mile, but then that's the limits of how far it goes, then the rest of the organism is just going to refill the gap. So the
Yeah,
question is,
totally.
how do you thread the needle with something that's both propagative and dissipative?
Yeah, yeah.
Because if it
You're definitely.
spreads, if it spreads, then it has to enable, the thing has to be living to spread it. But if it is some, or maybe you can have another species that somehow parasitizes or interferes.
We'll have to ask EcoHealth Alliance how to find the perfect balance of virality and transmissibility.
I think within 2 weeks, the big bad ant could be flattened.
Interesting.
Yeah, if
You
we
mean 2 weeks
just
from today?
no, just like the general 2 weeks, like with the right, if everybody just acted the right way, it could be
Yeah,
taken
if we
care
had a
of.
Manhattan project behind this, where it's like this thing needs to be out of here in 2 weeks, with a couple constraints about you don't obviously don't want to go thermonuclear on an ant colony in suburban California, though when push comes to shove, if things get heavy. Um, but yeah, I agree. Hopefully, we'll see that. I mean, not necessarily for the Argentina ant's sake, but hopefully, we'll see that level of cooperative, integrated entomological science and development in our lifetime, bro. And maybe we'll be a part of it.
Yeah, well, thanks for updating. Thanks for adding
Yeah,
in
I added. I
about.
could notice you had a couple typos in there.
Oh yeah, here I'm just adding them all to my personal dictionary. Yeah. Well, it's been fun. It's been real. I hope this was interesting to
It was awesome, man.
our limited but absolutely refined audience. And the show goes on.
Yep. An audience of two, even if it's just us, is more than one, not less than zero.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well,
All right, man. I'll
thank you,
see you on
Tucker.
the cybernet.
Farewell.
We'll talk soon, buddy. Bye.